Even today, Erwin Rommel remains one of the most recognizable commanders of World War II, still famously referred to as the Desert Fox for his daring initiative on the battlefields of North Africa. Rommel's legacy and ultimate destiny lay in his willingness to do something very few other generals would even consider: speaking the brutal truth about the progress of the war to Adolf Hitler. Erwin Rommel's young son, Manfred, witnessed his father's unpredictable relationship with Hitler. Rommel's honesty would one day cost him dearly.
We have interrupted this program to bring you another special release.
My father had at first no problems with Hitler.
Erwin Rommel was many things.
He was a brilliant tactical and operational leader who, at the same time, was blind to certain strategic realities about the regime that he was serving.
He was also a highly decorated lieutenant and German hero of World War I. After the demilitarization of the German armed forces following the Great War, Erwin Rommel chose to remain in the Army. First as an instructor, then later in the mid-1930s as Adolf Hitler's military escort at the annual Nuremberg rally. Over the years came promotions to captain, major, and colonel. Rommel and Hitler's paths would cross several more times ahead of Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, launching World War II. In 1940, Hitler gave Rommel command of the German 7th Panzer, or Tank Division. He led his panzers to quick victory in France and all the way to the English Channel. In February of 1941, Rommel was promoted to Lieutenant General. It was Erwin Rommel's next assignment that made him a legend, earning him one of the most famous nicknames in military history.
Confidence was something that Rommel never lacked for. The man had quite the ego. Of course, as the saying goes, it's not bragging if it's fact.
Erwin and Lucie Rommel had one child, Manfred, born in 1928. Manfred Rommel, like most young people in Nazi Germany, was eventually swept up into World War II, as well as into the shadow of his father.
He was a good father, a good husband. He was admirable.
Adolf Hitler's rise to Chancellor, then President of Germany, beginning in 1933, changed Rommel's life in many ways. What this small German family could not foresee was that their new Fuhrer had set his sights on world conquest, and also racial purity.
30,000 stormtroop veterans, and Hitler speaks.
Alles, was ihr durch mich, alles, was ich bin ich nur durch euch allein.
And his veterans cheer.
Sieg heil! Sieg heil! Sieg heil!
Hitler came to power by telling Germans that he would lead them back from economic and military ruin. The nation's despair, a result of the harsh penalties laid out against the country in the Treaty of Versailles, ending World War I.
The general feeling was that we had been unjustly treated, and so he used that ressentiment. I am the one who will bring your proud back, and I'll be the one who takes the injustice away from you.
Germany had no place in the world, had no standing in the world. Germany wasn't even a laughingstock. Germany was completely irrelevant.
But something more sinister was also in play in Germany. It would begin to reveal itself to Erwin Rommel and the majority of the German population after World War II was well underway. Irmgard Schmid was a schoolgirl in Germany.
I had information coming from all sides. There were the soldiers coming in and saying Germany is the greatest, the best, the finest, and our beloved Führer Adolf Hitler, unser heißgeliebter Führer, you know, stuff like that. In America, people would fall off their chairs screaming with laughter if we had to call any of our leaders hotly beloved, you know, our loved leader.
Auf seiner Fahrt an die Front vor Warschau begrüßt der Führer seine Leibstandarte, die sich bei den Herzkämpfen...
My father says Heil Hitler every morning. We have to say Heil Hitler 7 times a day. And if you think I don't know my German songs, here they are, you know, and I threw my hand out and belted out the German. Und heute ist es Deutschland und morgen die ganze Welt. You know, today it's Germany, tomorrow the whole world.
In 1939, nobody wanted a war except Adolf Hitler.
In early 1941, following the conquest of the majority of Western Europe, Adolf Hitler ordered his newest lieutenant general, Erwin Rommel, to go to North Africa. Rommel would be given command of 2 panzer divisions. Erwin Rommel's newly named Afrika Corps would be fighting the British in the desert. Before leaving for Africa, Rommel and Hitler met. There were no cracks in their relationship in 1941, as Rommel took over command of the Afrika Corps. That would change.
Rommel's relationship with Hitler before Rommel was sent to North Africa with the Afrika Corps was very much that of a superior subordinate, in that there was no questioning on the part of Rommel of Hitler's authority. Rommel became a favorite of Hitler's.
Since the very beginning, Hitler and Rommel's connection had been built on mutual experiences.
Rommel was a combat soldier, just as Hitler had been in the First World War.
Manfred Rommel, not yet a teenager, wondered if he would ever see his father again.
The relationship between Erwin Rommel and his son, Manfred Rommel, is in many ways very much a classic father-son relationship, in that the father wants the son to be one thing, to grow into this type of man, this type of individual, and the son has other ideas. Erwin Rommel had no qualms about talking with Manfred, expressing some misgivings about the direction the war was taking, and trying to pass on whatever fatherly advice that he could.
Erwin Rommel always wanted to lead. North Africa gave him yet another opportunity.
He wanted a combat command. He had been a combat officer in the First World War. He'd been very good at it. He thrived on it. He wanted to get back into the action. He was also personally very brave. He believed in leading from the front.
by 1941, English code breakers had already cracked Germany's secret code, known as enigma. The British were reading German military plans as they were being sent out from Berlin.
My father never believed it, that such a difficult code could be broken.
The Germans believed that the Enigma system would require years for a single message. The mistake is that in wartime, any assumption or presumption that you make about enemy capabilities can turn out to be wrong.
In North Africa, as was the case in France, Erwin Rommel led his German and Italian tanks and soldiers from the front lines. Seeing their commander in the thick of the fight earned Rommel great respect from his troops.
And he began an attack which brought back Libya in almost 2 weeks to the German-Italian forces.
Success came quickly in North Africa. Almost immediately, Rommel began driving the British Army out of key desert strongholds throughout 1941. The early victories by an aggressive and audacious Rommel in North Africa's western desert earned him more points with Adolf Hitler. Germany's Fuhrer felt the people back home needed to better know one of his most successful field commanders. Hitler promoted Rommel to field marshal. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels was told to make Erwin Rommel into a hero back in the fatherland.
The German propaganda minister began to mount a propaganda campaign to put and then keep Rommel's image in front of the German people. Rommel was a handsome man. It didn't hurt that he was photogenic. It didn't hurt that he was well-spoken. Rommel became the poster boy for the Wehrmacht.
The German army's new face of victory provided a much-needed boost of morale on the home front as the war headed into 1942.
The relations of my father to Hitler remained rather good. My father didn't come so often to Germany, and then Hitler did not interfere in his tactics because the African war was a very fast-going war.
Marshal Rommel ist tot. Der Held von Afrika.
Rommel's run of success in North Africa had given him freedoms not enjoyed in other parts of the world by German generals, especially those commanding in Russia, where Germany had invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. The Desert Fox, as Rommel had been respectfully branded by the British for his genius and daring, had latitude due to his early victories. When orders came in from the Nazi general staff and Rommel didn't like them, he ripped them up and did it his way. These actions baffled the British, who were still reading the Germans' coded messages telling them where the next battle would be fought.
The British were expecting that he was going to follow the orders that they were reading courtesy of Ultra, and which, almost as soon as Rommel got those orders, he tossed them out the window and did it his own way.
In late 1942, the fight in North Africa began to turn back in favor of the Allies.
It was the breakthrough. Within 2 hours, our light tanks were 40 miles behind Rommel's lines, destroying his transport.
Rommel's early successes were undone, mostly due to the British receiving tons more supplies, and also because the United States was now in the war and fighting alongside England in North Africa beginning in early November 1942.
Our artillery begins to find the range. A direct hit on an enemy 88mm gun position.
Field Marshal Erwin Rommel begged German leadership for more of everything to regain his lost momentum, but was met with silence.
I made a long list asking Hitler to do this in the meantime, and send the new tanks to Africa. But it was nothing done.
Hitler was taking a very hands-off approach. It was almost as if he didn't care. North Africa was to him a sideshow. Hitler fully expected the war to be over by the end of 1942.
The superiority of the British was so overwhelming, and the strategy was made so carefully and exactly that the Germans had no chance.
Rommel's Africa Corps attacked.
Despite shortages of material and men, Erwin Rommel led the fight to recapture North Africa. The odds were just too overwhelming, even for the legendary Desert Fox.
For the enemy, the situation worsened.
Frequent bouts of depression, insomnia, low blood pressure, headaches, and jaundice began to affect Rommel. Despite sickness and defeat, the reputation of Erwin Rommel continued to grow.
It really was a case of Rommel running rings around his opposition. They never really quite got the measure of him. And it wasn't until he was so badly outnumbered in men and materiel that he could not stop an Allied advance that he was finally compelled to retreat out of North Africa entirely.
With North Africa now lost, Erwin Rommel returned to Germany.
My father went to see Hitler in Rastenburg on his own initiative. And he said, we have to give up Africa. It's not more possible to do anything good under such circumstances. Then Hitler became unfriendly to him and said, how many rifles do you have in your army? My father said, I didn't count them. Hitler said, that's a wonderful general who doesn't even know how many rifles he has. And my father said, the best thing is you come to Africa and show us how to fight Montgomery with a carbine 98. And then Hitler said, leave the room. And my father went out and Hitler ran after him. So come back. And we all have shattered nerves, he said.
But the relationship was starting to sour. By the spring of 1943, Rommel began to feel that his troops in North Africa had been sacrificed needlessly. A sense of betrayal first began to manifest itself at this point. Whenever Rommel was in Hitler's presence, the tremendous charisma that Hitler possessed would serve to, at least temporarily, overcome the doubts that Rommel was beginning to have.
In May of 1943, 130,000 Germans and Italians surrendered in North Africa, signaling the end of the Axis fight there. It was around this time that many historians believe Erwin Rommel began to first hear stories of the executions and the mass murder of Russian prisoners of war and civilians.
It wasn't until late in 1943 when Rommel began to learn of the excesses committed by not just the SS, but by the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, started hearing the rumors about the concentration camps, the death camps, the final solution, that his whole attitude towards Hitler began to turn not just sour, but arguably hostile.
This was the Adolf Hitler Erwin Rommel didn't know, but was beginning to perceive.
Uniformed men came to our school and put up posters, inscribed posters saying, Die Juden sind unser Unglück, meaning the Jews are our downfall.
The entire huge organization to exterminate the Jews was concealed well enough so the majority of the people did not know about it.
And then my father discovered not only a lot of crimes which had been made, but also that this will be a tremendous dilemma and it will be not possible to come to a reasonable peace arrangement.
Denied another command in Italy, Rommel would eventually be put in charge of the defense of Western Europe.
The stage was set for the final confrontation that would come between Hitler and Rommel.
Before that happened, though, in February of 1943, the Germans were engaged on the Eastern Front in the Battle of Stalingrad. Russian soldier Boris Elon saw the vicious combat firsthand.
Сталинград – это коренной пункт для защиты Советского Союза тогда. Потому что туда пришел даже сам Жуков. Жуков был тогда, руководил армией. Так что и мы там имели очень важный пункт. Для защиты Сталинграда были переброшены очень большие силы. Немцы бомбили день и ночь.
Many historians believe this brutal winter fight was the turning point of World War II. The Germans and Axis powers suffered over 800,000 casualties. Following Stalingrad, the Russians began pushing the Germans out of the Soviet Union. Erwin Rommel and Adolf Hitler watched the results from Russia. Both knew it was only a matter of time before the Allies opened their much-anticipated Second Front in Western Europe. Because of his familiarity with the British and Americans from North Africa, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was given command of Western Europe's defense. There, Adolf Hitler championed his so-called Atlantic Wall, fixed fortifications along the coast that supposedly stretched over 1,600 miles, from Norway to the border of Spain. Hitler believed the defensive emplacements would stop any American-British invasion of Western Europe. What Erwin Rommel found on inspection was that Hitler's Atlantic Wall existed only in the Fuhrer's dreams.
My father had a rather realistic idea of the Allied tactics and way of fighting.
Rommel recognized that if the Germans were to stop an invasion in the West, they had to do it at the waterline in the first 24 hours of battle. They could not let the Allied army get ashore in Western Europe. Others disagreed with Rommel's strategy of stopping the Allies in the water.
My father was not very convincing, obviously. Field Marshal von Rundstedt still believed on the big mobile battle.
By the time he was given command in France in late 1943, Erwin Rommel had made up his mind about how things would ultimately end for Germany in World War II.
My father was absolutely certain that Germany cannot win any war anymore.
Rommel expected an Allied invasion to come somewhere along the coast of France because of its suitable landing beaches. Fortifications were strengthened and new ones built. Hundreds of thousands of mines were laid and thousands of obstacles constructed on the French coast. Bunkers and machine gun nests were put up to destroy landing craft before they hit the shoreline. Other insidious barriers would attempt to slow down soldiers at the water's edge and wreak havoc with paratroopers and gliders behind the eventual landing beaches. At least the Atlantic Wall was no longer pure fiction. Rommel moved his headquarters from Paris 40 miles closer to what he believed would be the eventual front lines on the coast of France. He would lead the defense of the West from here at La Roche-Guyon, a 12th century chateau overlooking the north bank of the River Seine. That was his plan anyway. In the spring of 1944, logic had it that any Allied assault would come at Pas-de-Calais, the closest point between France and England, just 19 miles across the English Channel. That's what Allied leaders wanted Rommel and Hitler to think. They even thought up an ingenious plan to make it seem that way.
One of the great stories of World War II that is poorly known to this day is Operation Fortitude.
An Allied army of soldiers, tanks, trucks, and radio traffic in England was set up. All of it fake. Wholly designed to point towards an Allied invasion coming at Calais, 150 miles northeast of the coast of Normandy.
And the Germans had no means to find out if this is true or not true.
It was, in its own way, every bit as complex and detailed and required as great a degree of precision as the Overlord landings on Normandy. The activities of the French resistance were carefully coordinated with Fortitude to, again, create the impression that the landings were going to happen in the Pas-de-Calais. Hitler was duped. If he had stayed with his original conviction of Normandy, the Normandy beaches might have been more heavily reinforced than they were. Rommel was duped just like almost every other senior German officer.
Adolf Hitler believed that Erwin Rommel and the Atlantic Wall would stop the Allies wherever the invasion took place. Hitler, however, never once visited any of the fortifications on the French coast to see for himself.
Rommel was like a jolt of electricity when he took over command.
In reality, this was now Rommel's Atlantic Wall.
And if he was going to be given command of the Atlantic Wall, he was going to turn it into an Atlantic Wall. He was going to do his damnedest to stop the Allies at the water's edge and not allow them to gain a foothold on occupied Europe.
First step, fortification of the coast with positions for infantry in the minefield, using the experiences from Africa, and then the armored division distributed on the different parts of the coast so that they can interfere on the same day or night. So he saw a certain chance to compensate the not existence of the German Navy and the rather poor existence of the Air Force. And my father was also convinced that no mobile battle in the size of 1940 was anymore possible, because the Allied British and Americans were so superior in the air that they would have nailed down the German armor, and it would have been hopeless for him.
The Atlantic Wall was being reinforced. Thinking the Allies intended to strike directly across the channel at its narrowest point, the enemy kept strong forces in the area and heavily fortified the Pas-de-Calais coastline.
He had hoped to have 6 million mines laid by the time the wall was finished and the Allies invaded. As it was, he got 2 million of those 6 million laid. But he trained the troops. He had constant exercises. When they weren't digging trenches and building bunkers and laying mines, they were training. Rommel, being Rommel, was able to not only get his manpower mobilized of turning the Atlantic Wall from a joke into what was literally one of the most formidable defensive systems ever emplaced in modern warfare. he came up with several different designs for beach obstacles, for mines, for detonation of mines and minefields, for sighting bunkers and designs of bunkers. He'd sketch out what his concept was and then hand it to his staff and tell them to make it a reality.
Im Hinblick auf unsere starken Anlagen, im Hinblick auf den vorzüglichen Geist unserer Truppe, auf die neue Bewaffnung und die Kampfmittel, die uns in die Hand gegeben sind, können wir den kommenden Ereignissen mit größter Ruhe entgegensehen und brauchen uns keine Sekunde den Kopf zerbrechen, gut oder schlecht geht. Es geht bestimmt gut. Und ich glaube nicht, dass England ein zweites Mal wiederkommt, wenn hier den Versuch macht.
He did a lot of fortifications himself, a lot of initiative and also imagination. He was more a manager, traveled around France and looked as his orders had been followed. The beaches had been, many of them had been very well fortified in a very short time.
Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was running out of time as May turned into June of 1944. He had done all he could, including adding Germany's battle-hardened 352nd Infantry Division to the Normandy coast. One huge advantage Rommel had going for him in early June 1944 was his knowledge of the tactics used in previous Allied landings in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, especially how they relied on weather reports.
June is a particularly nasty month weather-wise in the English Channel.
Holding to form, the weather in early June 1944 along the English Channel coast of France was very windy, very wet, and predictably nasty. However, Allied weather forecasters had seen something German meteorologists didn't see: a 48-hour break from the elements beginning on June 6th. Allied Supreme Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower said go. D-Day. The decision to launch Operation Neptune Overlord in less than suitable conditions would stun Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. The choice of Normandy as the location was also surprising. It was not Pas-de-Calais.
He was very surprised because he relied on the expert view of the German Kriegsmarine that nobody could land under such weather conditions. It was a very courageous decision of General Eisenhower and a very successful. The Navy was not existent. The Air Force also said no, by such a weather it's not worth to get our machines out. And so the first to notice the invasion was the infantry. This is extraordinary.
But making matters much worse for the Germans on the morning of June 6, 1944, was that the commander of the Atlantic Wall was not even in France. Erwin Rommel decided it would be a good time to return to his home in Herrlingen, Germany, to accomplish two objectives, one personal and one professional.
Because he had the intention to go to Hitler and tell him again what it means if the Normandy has been fallen. He used to visit my mother, who had her 50th birthday. And so my father was in our house near Ulm on the 6th of June.
At 7:20 on the morning of June 6th, 6:20 a.m. in France, the telephone rang at the Rommel house in Germany. 17,000 Allied airplanes, 7,000 ships, and some 160,000 Allied troops were either attacking Normandy or just off the coast.
We have interrupted this program to bring you another special invasion broadcast.
Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air force,
and his field commander, the great Montgomery of Egypt in North Africa,
have attacked along miles of the French coast.
Elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world.
And then he said it takes 24 hours. Afterward, we know what is going on. And from this was the beginning of my father's conviction that not only the war is lost, but the battle is lost.
Manfred Rommel was also home on June 6th with his father. The young teenager had been called up to join the German Luftwaffe as a flak helper for an anti-aircraft gun.
But I had the opportunity to see my father. So I'm one of the first German understanding that an invasion had begun.
Manfred witnessed his father's initial reaction to reports of the Normandy landings. He also saw his frustration of not being able to get back to his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon at that decisive moment in history.
He was not pleased, not at all. He said, he wished I was in France. There was still no clear picture of the situation in my father's and Rundstedt's headquarters. They still were doubtful if this really had been the landing. But this changed in 1 hour, and my father began to call his driver and to prepare himself for departing to France. And he said, this is very painful that they are landing while I'm not there.
Following more reports from his chief of staff, Hans Speidel, Erwin Rommel left Herrlingen, Germany, by car for France around 10:30 in the morning of June 6th. The field marshal arrived back at La Roche-Guyon around 9 p.m. There were still thoughts that morning that Normandy was just a diversion. The real attack would still come at Pas de Calais. Operation Fortitude's plan of deception had been an overwhelming success. It worked so well that the German 15th Army stayed at Calais, waiting well into July for an invasion that never came. Allied control of the skies hindered any immediate response by German tanks and reserve infantry on D-Day and the days that followed, just as Rommel had predicted.
Direct hits are scored on roads used by the Nazis to bring up reinforcements against our largest initial beachhead, less than 10 miles away.
They found very exactly where the Germans are.
In addition to winning the air battle, American and British ships controlled the Channel coast. Their big guns reached deep inland.
Some commanders of Germany said it's not possible that they fire over a distance of 30 kilometers. It's quite something that was possible to control the coast.
An den Boden gepresst liegen die Männer in Deckung.
The Allies had managed to land 156,000 troops ashore and had driven an average of 4 to 6 miles inland. On June 7th, Rommel drove to Normandy to see the desperate situation for himself.
My father analyzed the situation, but came back to his headquarters.
Despite 10,000 casualties, the Allies had established their beachhead. A week after D-Day, Erwin Rommel knew full well the war in Western Europe was lost. Rommel's bluntness about the situation in Normandy with Adolf Hitler was not appreciated by the Fuhrer. The two met on June 15th to discuss Normandy.
My father even, he did not exclude that Hitler might give in when he sees that there is no hope. We cannot win the war. And this is not possible, we must see that. And then Hitler said to my father, I see it well, but with me nobody will make peace. And this was, many people had to discover that Hitler would more like to lead the Germans to the disaster.
Erwin Rommel knew all along that all his mines, obstacles, fortifications, and infantry could never stop the Allies. By gaining their beachhead, Rommel knew that the Anglo-American alliance now held all the cards in the West. As the Battle of Normandy raged, Erwin Rommel began articulating that the only way to save Germany was for Adolf Hitler to seek a truce with the Americans and the British.
We were in a very poor situation. My father was convinced that the Germans had never had any chance to win the battle on the beaches. The war was lost. The Allies were in a position where they had not to concede anything to the Germans. Hitler had to disappear, and the only thing you could do, only thing good you could do as a German general was to surrender.
Rommel told Hitler to make peace, even if that meant that Hitler had to step down as Fuhrer, as head of state. If the Allies would not negotiate with Hitler, and Hitler openly admitted, no one will negotiate with me, in that case, it was time for Hitler to step aside. And as Rommel put it, the proper considerations have to be taken.
Erwin Rommel's forthrightness with Hitler came to a head on July 15, 1944, in a 3-page letter to the Fuhrer. In it, Rommel told Hitler the war in the West was lost, and in so many words that the Fuhrer of Germany should now sue for peace in the West. Ending the fight in Western Europe would also allow Germany to devote more resources to defending itself against the fast-approaching Russians in the East.
The only thing that Erwin Rommel could have done, he could have done no other. He could not have remained silent and watched the Germany that he loved be destroyed in the name of a man that he had come to detest.
There had been rumblings that others also wanted Adolf Hitler removed. Their goal, however, was to assassinate him. A small group was working on a plan to murder Hitler in the summer of 1944.
The great majority were passive. In the Third Reich, it was not possible to tell to your friend, we should kill Hitler and make a revolution. Maybe the friend is such a patriot that he runs to the police and denounces you. Although the German resistance movement was composed of staff officers, of priests, of elite who knew that they were not falling in the hands of traitors. But in public, to talk to people, this was suicide.
The war was no longer about Germany. The war had morphed into being about Adolf Hitler. And at that point, in Rommel's estimation, it certainly became evil. And Hitler became evil with it. Because Hitler was no longer working for Germany's general good. He was using Germany to preserve himself. The honeymoon was long past. The time for a divorce was coming.
Erwin Rommel was not in favor of killing Germany's leader. Rommel's oath to serve his country superseded any murderous plot. Erwin Rommel wanted Hitler out, but felt assassination was not an option. Rommel believed Hitler should surrender Germany to the Western Allies first, then stand trial in court by the German people. Any thoughts of being part of a murder plot was not something Erwin Rommel actively considered in 1944. However, he did listen to some of those German officers in favor of Hitler's assassination.
Now, this is where it gets tricky. The whole idea of assassination of a head of state was something that would have been abhorrent to Erwin Rommel simply because it wasn't done. And by that I mean this is a patently illegal act. It's not the way Germans do things. It was treason, pure and simple, in Rommel's eyes. He was prepared to countenance Hitler being arrested and removed from his position as Fuhrer of the Third Reich. He was not willing to countenance assassination. It's the difference between a legal and an illegal action.
On July 17, 1944, while returning to La Roche-Guyon from a conference, 2 British Spitfires caught up with Erwin Rommel's staff car near the French town Saint-Germain-de-Montgomery.
The car was forced off the road and into the ditch. In the process, Rommel, who was sitting in the front seat, was thrown against the frame of the windshield, smashed the left side of his face to the point where it was almost disfiguring.
The Hesper Hospital, and at first supposed that he will die in the same night. The driver did not survive, but my father did. And this was the end of his military career.
His cheekbone was crushed, the orbit for his left eye received a fractured skull. Interestingly enough, it didn't seem to do anything to him psychologically. He was still very alert and aware, but it took him out of the battle completely. He never held active command again after that. He was relieved of command for medical reasons. And that really marked the end of his combat career.
Before suffering his severe injuries on July 17th, Erwin Rommel had allegedly been working on an alternative scenario for ending the war in Western Europe, sooner rather than later. Rommel's arrangement involved taking matters into his own hands and dealing with the Allies himself if Hitler would not.
Therefore, he decided to try to render the army. But he couldn't do so because he was hit by the bullets and grenades of 2 British fighters and was out of action since July 17th.
Operations Room, Hitler's headquarters, following the attempt Fuhrer's life. Conjecture runs high as to whether in fact he did escape at the time or succumbed later to his injuries.
The planned July 20th, 1944 attempt to assassinate Adolf Hitler at the Fuhrer's Rastenburg headquarters in East Prussia, also known as the Wolf's Lair, failed. More than 5,000 people would be tried and executed for the attempt on Adolf Hitler's life. Most were not involved in any way, but it allowed Hitler to eliminate many of those he felt were not loyal to him. One of those on his list was his once favorite field marshal. Rommel would never be allowed a public trial. Adolf Hitler would make sure of that. Rommel was guilty of speaking the truth to Hitler. It didn't matter if he was in on the plot to kill Hitler or not. Rommel committed treason in Hitler's eyes for having a defeatist attitude. In the fall of 1944, Hitler's form of justice caught up with Erwin Rommel while he was recuperating at home in Herrlingen, Germany.
When Erwin Rommel woke up on the morning of October 14th, 1944, he had no idea that it was his last day on Earth. Around noon, two general officers, SS generals, came calling and informed him that a military tribunal had concluded that he was guilty of acting against the Fuhrer and the interests of the fatherland. He was given a choice. One of the generals had brought a vial of cyanide with him. Rommel could take the cyanide, commit suicide. No actions would be taken against Lucie or Manfred. Rommel would be given a state funeral, and there would be no mention whatsoever about any disfavor that Rommel might have fallen into with Hitler. Or the alternative was that Rommel could dispute the charges and be brought before a people's court. You didn't leave the people's court with an acquittal. It was only a question of how much of a circus and how much of a farce they would make out of the proceedings before a pronouncement of guilt and a death sentence was handed down. He had a brief scene with Lucie, telling her that in a quarter of an hour, I'll be dead. There were two men outside. They brought poison. This is the price I have to pay for telling the truth to Hitler. So Rommel asked Manfred to be strong and to be there for his mother. And then he drove off with the two SS generals. And a few hundred yards up the road, they pulled over to the side. The two generals got out of the car, walked a short distance away. Rommel took the poison. They came back. He was gasping for air. He was already unconscious and almost dead. Within minutes, he was dead.
Numa cerimônia oficial, o povo alemão despede-se do mais bravo de seus generais.
He was given a state funeral. At one point, Field Marshal von Rundstedt had to declare, because his speech was scripted by Goebbels' propaganda department.
Com ele, assim disse o Führer numa ordem do dia.
Von Rundstedt had to declare that Rommel's heart belonged to the Fuhrer, which of course was absolute nonsense. But Rommel had done the honorable thing. It was the only choice he had, really.
Adolf Hitler had succeeded in ridding himself of one of his only generals who dared tell him the truth about the war.
A população de uma cidade
Following Rommel's death, Hitler led Germany to almost total ruin before finally committing suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30th, 1945. By that time, millions more Germans had died unnecessarily, and the Soviet Union was set to claim half of Germany as communist property. Germany's once most celebrated field marshal had been proven right in the end. Erwin Rommel had paid for his prophetic words and brutal honesty with his life.